Everyone, thank you very much. I have to say it's been a real pleasure to have Italy's reputation sort of, rehabilitated a little bit through food, given the recent sort of political shenanigans of most of our population, unfortunately. And so I'm very proud to wear my nationality today, and I'm definitely 100% Italian. I wanted to thank the organisers for inviting me to start off with, because I didn't know anything about Bashara School, and I know very little about farming, unfortunately, which, maybe will be a bit of a problem today. But I want to thank you very much for inviting me. It's been absolutely amazing to be here for the weekend and really, really inspirational. And the speakers who spoke this morning, I've been thoroughly inspired too. So although I'm not a farmer, I'm an academic, and I rarely touch earth. I think I planted some tomatoes yesterday for the first time. When I was a child, for many years, when adults would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I always said a farmer's wife. And I had this image of myself, wearing a kerchief and a sort of long floaty dress and skipping through meadows and cuddling lambs, and in the background there'd be sort of, the hills are alive, as I'd go and smell the roses. And my mum sort of shattered that dream when I was about 13 and said, well, as a farmer, you're not going to be sort of listening to your Walkman lying underneath the trees all day, listening to the sound of music. You're going to be working really, really, really hard. And so that's when I shifted directions. And I've spent a lot of time in academia, and I've spent some time sort of doing activist work as well. And I think that, I'm coming to the end of my PhD, and it's time for me to make some decisions. And I'm very, very inspired by the farming community. So maybe I'll be back with a kerchief, and I'll have some stories to tell about my exploits with lambs. Who knows? Today I'm going to talk about, where am I? I'm going to talk about the relationship between bodies, kinship and food, and how in Amazonia these ideas influence people's views on cultivation, the earth, and their role as horticulturalists. The point I'm going to make is that in Amazonia, at least, and I think that this point has been made today as well, so there'll be a lot of sort of reflection on what's been said this morning. We can't speak about agriculture without reference to ideas about what constitutes humanity, bodies, kinship, and well-being. So I have been working, I've been doing this PhD for 4.5 years, and sometimes I will fall into the awful habit of jargon. So stop me if I'm using some silly word that I could actually be, I could actually be speaking in English. So, and bear with me, because I am going to sort of build on all the pieces of the puzzle, and right at the end, it'll all make sense. So, I've been working with Ashaninka people, who are quite a large Amazonian indigenous population in Peru, in eastern Peru. And they're horticulturalists. They love to hunt and fish and gather and have a great time. And I spent about 2 years between 2007 and 2009 doing my field work there. I'm going to start with a short story about a woman called Nancy, to sort of introduce the idea of bodies in Amazonia. Nancy was a woman that I met the first time I went to the field in 2007, and she was a vibrant community leader, full of life, full of anger at petrol companies, hilarious, and a really lovely, lovely woman. And about a year later, I was living in Pamaquiari, which is the community I spent most of my time in. And she didn't come from Pamaquiari, she came from further upriver, and she visited the village because she needed to be healed, because she was severely depressed, suicidal even. She was in a very bad way. She would drink a lot and get aggressive and forget who she was, and she was very, very depressed, basically, very, very low. And the healing process, I'm not going to go into it, and if you can ask me about it afterwards, because it's quite long to explain, but the healing process involved taking the objects that were causing her sadness out of her body. So And she left feeling a lot better, and objects had come out. It's quite mysterious, but I can explain. But later on. She basically, the point of this short story, and I'll come back to Nancy later, is that emotions are in our bodies in Amazonia. They're not. They rest within our bodies, as does knowledge and morality. So when we feel with our bodies. When we act, we're acting with our bodies, and when we're learning and thinking, we're thinking with our bodies. So while bodies and souls are definitely separate entities in Amazonia, bodies and minds aren't. Bodies and minds sort of are one thing, and it's the body that's the sort of the locus of everything that happens in our sort of sentient world. So in fact, there isn't a word for mind in many. You talk about our thinking, but that thinking happens in the body. There's a very clear concept of what is a good body in Amazonia and among the Ashaninka. A good body is a body that acts morally, that doesn't impinge on other people's freedom and autonomy, that is happy, laughs a lot, is also emotionally restrained, so doesn't get angry or aggressive, and learns how to behave properly, and learns how to is not resistant to hard work, and as a woman knows how to weave, and as a man knows how to do what men do. I didn't find out much of that because I spent a lot of my time with the women, but men definitely do a lot of stuff in the Amazon as well. So given that in the view of Ashaninka people, bodies are the location of changeable things such as emotions and thoughts and morality, it's no surprise that in Amazonia people think of their bodies as inherently transformational and inherently unstable. So if our body is transformed, so is our ability to act morally and to act appropriately. And in fact, Nancy was sick and she was acting inappropriately and she was sad, which is a very terrible emotion to have in Amazonia, because of a sort of funny sequence of events. Her husband had been out hunting in the forest and had come across an old man who had taken poison to kill himself. And there is a reason, in the Ene Valley where I work, there is a sort of relatively surprisingly high level of suicide, and I'll come to that a lot later. Her husband had talked to this suicidal man as he was dying, and he'd come back home and told his wife about it, and they'd slept together and shared a bed. And she had basically, the word that I was given to explain this by my Ashaninka friend Cesar was, she was transmitted the criterion of sadness. The criterion of sadness was bodily transmitted from the dying man to her husband and through sleeping together to her body. And that's why she was sad. And it was that criterion that had to be removed from her body. So she wasn't sad because she had all this terrible stuff that was happening to her. She was sad because sadness had come into her body, basically. So this shows how porous and unstable and transformable bodies are in the Amazon. And speaking of porous bodies, I might not look like an Ashaninka person to any of you, but for a little while I was Ashaninka. And this picture here is shockingly staged. I never did any farming work. I just thought I'd put it in because we're in a farming forum here. And they totally wanted me to sort of look like I'd done a bit, so I sort of put some sesame seeds in the ground and then walked back to my real job. Because when I first came, I didn't know really what to do with myself, and I wanted to explore everything. So I rolled up my sleeves and put on my kerchief and took a machete and said, well, back where I come from, women do men's jobs anyway. So I sort of went to the field, and we were clearing a plot. The men allowed me to join them for a little bit, and we were clearing a plot for manioc. And I had my machete, and I sort of managed 1 square meter, and they'd finished the whole plot in one morning. But it was when they saw me sawing a little papaya plant this big with my machete blade, painfully, that they decided that I should go, and that it was time that I was packed off to hang out with the women, because this was really pathetic with the machete blades. All they did was 1 whack and the whole thing came down. So this picture up here is a sort of is a series. It comes from a series of compositions called sort of Still Life with a White Girl. And basically, there was the daughter of my family, Yeni. She really enjoyed taking pictures of me doing Ashaninka things. So I'd be, you know, there is a series here where I'm being offered a Masato bowl or an egg or something, a leg, a joint of something. And here I am. This is my favorite one because I'm sort of festooned in feathers and crowns and things, and making my weaving bolster sort of. I basically spent most of my time weaving and spinning because my body needed to be transformed. Now, this is the point I'm trying to make with this slide. There is little Darwin. Yeah, his name was Darwin. He was offering me a caterpillar, and that's me eating it. And then the final photo is of me with my kushma, which is a traditional dress, and on the front of it says Naro Ashaninka, which means I am Ashaninka. And basically, after weeks of feeding me good Ashaninka food and teaching me how to be a proper Ashaninka woman and making me drink loads of fermented manioc beer called Masato, I'd finally my body had basically transformed into an appropriate Ashaninka body. So it doesn't really matter what you look like, it's what you do and how you act, what you eat and how you feel that makes you who you are. So at the end of the day, social relationships make a body in Amazonia. And your personhood, a person is who they are because of who they're presently sharing their life with. And a body is never a biological given. It's always socially constructed. So for Amazonian peoples, a body is made, and it's always under the process of fabrication. It's never quite finalized. So unfortunately, I'm no longer Ashaninka. I haven't been living there. I haven't been weaving for a very long time. It would take me quite a long time to learn again. And so bodies in this way are constantly changing. And I usually give this sort of argument to my boyfriend when I'm trying to eat his food in the restaurant, that we're sort of becoming one if he allows me to take from his plate, which he doesn't like at all, but you know. So it also means that bodies that have lost some humanity, like Nancy's body, can regain their humanity through sort of social care, the care of their kin. So what is important for the maintenance of good moral bodies is the presence and the care of kin. And it's through sharing with kin and through love and care that Ashaninka bodies maintain their humanity, their identity, and their capacity to live well together. So in this sense, kinship can be seen not as a biological given, but also as a continuous process and a result of sharing and caring among a group of people. And there's a very easy example for this: adoption. In the community where I lived, a little boy, one mum had 7 boys, and on her 8th, she said, no, that's enough. And she gave her little boy away to her neighbor who had 3 girls and really wanted a boy. And there was never any question that that boy was actually the child of the adopted parents, because there is no concept of biological parenthood. Parenthood is social in Amazonia. So little Roger was definitely the kin of his siblings and his parents, because he was eating the same food as them and sharing their beds, and they were, you know, breastfeeding from his siblings and things like that. So the fact that kinship is a product of care, the consequence of the fact that kinship is a product of care is that people must care for each other continually in order to maintain kinship. And living in caring kinship relationships that involve continuous sharing is what Amazonian peoples generally associate with the good life and with fundamental well-being. So I'm using the concept good quite a lot, and there's a term called kametsa in Ashaninka, which means good and beautiful. So it sort of maintains all the beautiful things in life are called kametsa. So when I say the word good, think also beautiful. And there are some important ways in which care is shown and in which kinship is cemented. So obviously you have affection and love and laughter, but also substances. They have a very important role. Food and drink that are lovingly prepared by kin, breast milk and other bodily fluids. Substances have the power to transform the body, and that is why food and drink are so important. Keeping one's kin's bodies filled with appropriate substances will maintain good moral bodies and good kinship relationships. What this means is that Ashaninka people are very specific about what kind of food is appropriate, or what kind of food is what they call legitimate. and the word for legitimate there is sanori. So legitimate food is the kind of food that does the work of maintaining good Ashaninka relationships between true Ashaninka people when it is shared, and what kind of food does nothing and has negative effects. So basically, the most important sanori food that must be eaten to make good Ashaninka bodies is manioc. That's absolutely can't do without it. There are many other important foods and many other sanori foods, but manioc is absolutely essential. And here is a photo of people making manioc beer called Masato. So Masato is the Spanish term, piarensi is the Ashaninka term. Basically what happens is women make this beer, and they steam a load of manioc and then they start chewing it. They start chewing the manioc and putting it back in the bowl, and chewing sweet potato, raw sweet potato, and spitting it back in the bowl, and then that is sort of chewed for hours and hours, and little children dip their hands in and eat it and run away with it. But this is here that their hands aren't in because I've asked them to all sort of pose with their hands in the bowl. They're actually collecting, you know, a bit of manioc to chew, to spit back in. And I did a lot of this too. I chewed and spat for a long time. And basically after that you put water into the mixture and it's fermented, and this is the absolute core of Ashaninka social life is manioc beer. And it's the fact that it's chewed that is so important, because it's through the sharing of bodily substance that kinship is maintained. So Ashaninka people find it really, really hard to survive a day without drinking copious amounts of Masato. I never saw one adult drink water, in fact. And they were always really astounded that I always wanted water, and I was always boiling my little water canister because I couldn't drink beer all day. But they are always drinking beer. Even the little babies, 6-month-old babies, are sort of given a little spoonful of beer every now and then. And everyone is always visiting each other to partake of their kin's beer, because it's a process of social integration. It's a really important social glue. So manioc is also eaten steamed, and it's eaten with a lot of sanori foods like game, fish, and snails, and caterpillars, and it's eaten all day long. This is a little quote that I got in an interview, which I think is really beautiful. And basically the old man said, when I asked him what is it to be a true Ashaninka, he said, to eat the animals of the earth, the animals of the river, the animals of the forest. This is what I'm accustomed to. This is what makes me a true Ashaninka. So eating legitimate sanori foods is, alongside sharing and commensality, one of the most important elements that ensure Ashaninka people will behave, think, and feel like good Ashaninka people ought, which is also why I was fed so well, and I had to try absolutely everything. It's very important to note that the well-being of the group is invariably linked to the ability of its constituents to live like proper Ashaninka, like Ashaninka sanori. So non-legitimate foods include our kinds of food, like pasta, rice, canned tuna, as Alia was saying. And these are very occasionally eaten to make do, especially in the rainy season when protein isn't so readily available. And they will always be consumed with manioc if they're eaten, but they're definitely not good enough. And you never ever want to rely on that kind of food, because it will just cause social disintegration at the end of the day. And sometimes ingesting alien non-sanori substances can come with real problems. And it was often the case that men who drank industrial Peruvian beer would become aggressive, and domestic violence would ensue. And I was always told that it was because they had drunk beer, because Peruvian beer makes them become like Peruvian men, who are well known for being aggressive and violent with their wives. So if they stuck to Masato, and even if they got absolutely rip-roaring drunk with it, they'd never get violent, which was always pretty astounding to me. But this is to show how substances can change the body and change the morality of the person who's ingesting them. So if morality, knowledge, and emotional health and well-being depend so much on eating appropriate foods, then clearly cultivation is going to be an important activity for Ashaninka people, because that's where their sanori food comes from. So that's manioc, the lady is carrying. In Amazonian creation narratives, many of the elements of their landscapes and lives, including certain stones and plants and animals, many plants and animals, once were Ashaninka and were transformed. Sometimes the transformation was affected by a culture hero called Avireri, and sometimes people just got themselves into trouble. They were cocky, and and they would be transformed into an armadillo or whatever, or sort of some nasty little pricking insect or something. Sometimes it was through no fault of their own. They just sort of happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they were transformed. So while these animals, most animals in the forest, don't have a human shape anymore, they have a human identity. And by maintaining an Ashaninka identity, these plants and animals, when they're consumed, are reinforcing the Ashaninka identity of the consumer, which is why they're considered sanori and which is why they're so important. And given this, most plants that are cultivated once were human beings and must be treated with utmost respect because they are sentient beings as a result. So this is the bit where I talk for 2 seconds about farming, and then I go back to something social again. Well, no, not the farming is not social, but something that I don't know much about farming. That's basic. So what I know is that Ashaninka women sing to the manioc when they harvest its roots, and they sing soothing lullabies. They promise the manioc that it will be given fish and meat to eat, so that the manioc will agree to release its roots from the earth without breaking. And that's a bit like Native North American people who sort of ask the animal whether they can hunt it before killing it and sort of come to an agreement. Manioc also doesn't like being eaten alone. Manioc must also always be eaten with a protein, because otherwise the plants will just wither and die. It's very disrespectful. And one can never joke around with one's food. I discovered on my first trip when I was given a plate of soup and I found a little rigor mortis squirrel hand inside it, and I sort of put my little piece of manioc in there and started playing and sort of joking around with the kids and eating my manioc from my little rigor mortis hand, and I was told absolutely no. I was very gently told off and told that next time I went to the river to bathe, I'd be eaten by a jaguar because I'd played with my food, and I was terrified when I went to the river, but I never ever again played with my food. So what I'm trying to say with these anecdotes is that there's a very close relationship between respectful human behavior and the well-being of the plant. And taking appropriate care and showing respect to the manioc is of utmost importance if one wishes to harvest a healthy, nutritious crop that will help maintain the sanori nature of Ashaninka bodies. And in order to produce good manioc, one must take care of the land. So taking care of the land involves working it, and work is sort of the biggest ideal in Ashaninka social life. Being a good worker is your best asset. It's in the act of work that Ashaninka people give their love and their good intentions to the land in order to ensure sanori crops. It's through bodily contact with the earth and with the crops, and with appropriate behavior, and there are a certain number of rules to follow. There aren't that many, and they aren't very strict, but there are definitely a few rules that are key. That the crops are transformed into products that will make good Ashaninka people when they're eaten. And it's a wholly mutual relationship. The earth and the plants will give good sanori food if Ashaninka people behave respectfully in return. So what happens when Ashaninka people stop tending the earth? And this is a bit of a sad bit of the presentation. Between the mid-1980s and the late 1990s, the Ene Ashaninka, the valley where I work, underwent perhaps the most brutal episode in the history of contact with outsiders. The Shining Path, a Maoist-Leninist guerrilla group that launched a revolution in the early 1980s in Peru, entered the forest of Selva Central in the mid-1980s, hoping to convince the notoriously rebellious Ashaninka into their revolutionary columns. And initially they were partially successful. They promised Ashaninka people dramatic and wondrous changes in their lives, including justice meted out to all those who had attempted to subdue them in the past. However, the Ashaninka soon found out that guerrilla people seemed much more bent on killing and on torturing them than on changing their lives. And eventually they began to realize the extent of the guerrillas' capacity for violence and began to flee, and they began to take up arms against the Shining Path. So there was a big war, basically, and pitting family members against each other. Given their bloodthirsty violence, the guerrillas were rapidly defined as demonic in Ashaninka thought. But sadly, thousands of Ashaninka were being held hostage in Sendero Luminoso columns, or shining path columns. They were forced to eat guerrilla food. They were forced to share their beds with guerrillas. They were carrying out the orders of the guerrilla leaders. And in the process, many Ashaninka people lost some of their humanity. Their bodies were transformed as a result. And they gained something of the demonic themselves. And this is the reason that there still are quite a few suicides in Vienna, because some people feel like they haven't ever been able to get rid of that aspect of themselves. As a result of the war, kinship was destroyed. Some Ashaninka joined the guerrillas, became demonic and killed their kin. Families were separated. Children were brought up without the appropriate care because they were put into special sort of revolutionary schools, so they weren't given the necessary care. Especially children are so fragile and soft. Their bodies are so soft. They really need care from all their kin in order to be able to grow up into proper moral Ashaninka beings. So the children were separated, and basically the very humanity that was so carefully maintained through social living and care between Ashaninka became threatened. And in their flight, most Ashaninka people abandoned their plots and gardens and houses, and many were forced to abandon them by the guerrilla leaders. And a lot of people will talk about how desperately sad the valley looked back in the 1990s, when you'd just see plots and houses abandoned. That's the saddest thing for them to remember is the abandonment of their crops and the abandonment of their land. Many violent battles were fought out on Ashaninka lands, and many people died tragically and very violently. It's horrific to say that almost half, if not more than half, the population of the valley I worked in perished. So about 6,000 people, and now there are 10,000 of them. So as a result of all the violence, my friend Cesar once told me, we have upset the earth. The good spirits ran away. They went and hid in the mountains, and they're definitely still not seen in community territories. And Ashaninka relationships with the earth really suffered. There are still many places where 20 years ago they would sow bountiful harvests of manioc, but now if they try, they just dry up and die. Nothing can grow. And I was told that it's because of all the blood and the bones and the ghosts that remain in the earth after the war. They're just sort of traumatized her. She's just not giving right now. She's still very angry. And so basically now the work of Ashaninka people is cut out for them. They gradually returned to their territories toward the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, and they still are moving back to their family lands. And since then, they have been very, very hard at work, sowing, harvesting, and eating proper, legitimate Ashaninka food. Laughing, they laugh all the time. It's a surprising thing. You go there and you know this horrific history, and they are laughing all the time. They're making the best of everything, and they just want their land and their families to become proper Ashaninka people again. So they're rehabilitating their own bodies by eating good food in order to, through hard work and through giving back and through engaging with the land, rehabilitating the earth and making her bountiful again. And gradually they're able to exorcise those terrible memories and those terrible substances from the land. And all of their efforts are currently directed at that. And they will fight to the death again to be able to do just that. And so this is the stance they're taking against many of the threats they're now facing, which take the shape of petrol companies and dams and all sorts of horrific things. So that's basically the story I wanted to tell, to illustrate the importance of the relationship between human bodies' well-being and the earth. And among Amazonian peoples, bodies, kinship, food and cultivation are all irreducibly intertwined, and the health of the earth depends on the maintenance of the positive, virtuous relationships between them all. So thank you very much. That's it, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions.